Despite being in my early 30s, I've always hesitated to call myself an adult. I learned that my parents shared this sentiment when I was kicked out of the house. They said they were doing it so I could finally learn how to take care of myself. After everything that has happened, they feel terrible, but I don't blame them. No one can be held responsible except for the man who held me captive and forced me to become a mother to his doll. When my parents changed the locks, they were nice enough to leave an envelope with some cash to get me started, but with few marketable workplace skills, I was quickly going through this money and they refused to answer my calls or open the door to talk to me. It was sink or swim time, and I needed money quick. I sent out responses to every Craigslist ad I could find that would allow me to start work immediately. My captor posted an ad looking for a full-time nanny to look after his daughter while he was at work. I hated kids. But the pay was great, and the ad said no experience necessary. The only requirement was for a motherly touch. I certainly didn't have that, but I thought I could fake it for the right price. The phone interview was very brief. The man was awkward, nervous, and rambling. It was really tough to follow his train of thought, but after a few minutes of talking, he invited me out to his house to meet his daughter, Julie, and further discuss the job. Seeing the inside of his house did nothing to comfort the weird vibes I got about the man over the phone. Clearly, he was a hoarder. Newspapers, magazines, and books were stacked everywhere and looked like they could fall over at the slightest touch. Not the safest environment for a kid, even if you didn't take the general unclean appearance of the place into account. He showed me the living room where we sat on opposite couches that looked like they did not receive very much use. I tried my best to smile and ask the appropriate questions to show him how interested I was in the job. But he did most of the talking. His sentences were jilted and he refused to look me in the eyes. He never once mentioned Julie's mother, and I certainly didn't feel comfortable asking why she wasn't in the picture. As off-putting as he was, it was clear that he cared for Julie very deeply. I was worried that she didn't have a strong female role model in her life. When he started to describe what he wanted from me, I really started to get uncomfortable. Julie needs a mom. That's you. No, she needs you to hold her, feed her, watch her sleep. Together we can give her this. She can feel loved. All I wanted was out of this house and to never come face to face with this man ever again. When he formally offered me the job and reached out his large hand for a shake, I told him that I had other offers I was looking at and I would have to get back to him. He looked me in the eye for the first time and just stared at me for a full 20 seconds. It was impossible to read his face, but I knew that I had to get out of there. So I thanked him for his time and told him I would call him tomorrow before getting up and briskly making my way for the front door. He followed very closely behind, not saying a word. I should have run. This was not the time to be polite. He injected me with something before I reached the door. When I woke up, I was in a small dark room. The walls were padded with foam rubber like you'd see in a recording studio. All warmth had drained my body from lying unconscious on the concrete floor. The only source of light was from a small glass window at the center of the only door. Of course, I tried the knob, but it was locked. I tried to break the glass, and to no luck. I clawed my way through the foam only to find hardwood behind it. I screamed until my voice gave out. Eventually, I had no choice but to give up, and I sat on the floor until he returned. He spoke to me, muffled through the door. Again, the sick man told me that Julie needed a mother. He couldn't give her everything she needed and wanted me to fill that emptiness inside of her. I told him to go fuck himself. This continued for days. He'd cry and plead that if I wouldn't do it for him, at least I could do it for Julie. She needed a loving family. She deserved it. I was hungry, thirsty, and working on nearly no sleep, but I wasn't prepared to give in to the demands of a madman. He was a large man, but I knew he would eventually have to open this door, and at that time, I would be ready to fight him with everything I had to regain my freedom. When he realized I wasn't going to agree to be Julie's mother, he completely lost it. The ear-piercing scream that man let out as he beat the walls outside of my cell brought me to my knees. His cries were the sound of pain mixed with anger, and then his face returned to the window. It was a deep, raw red and streaked with tears. The raw hatred in his face scared me to my core. He let out another roar before unlocking the door and ripping it open. The fight had completely left me. I backed into the corner and put more space between us, but my captor quickly closed the gap and pulled me up by my hair. He wrapped his muscled arms around my throat and put his lips right against my ear as he screamed, "You're just like the others! Putting yourself before my beautiful daughter! You stupid, selfish bitch! You couldn't possibly understand what love is! Fuck you! I'll show you what happens to those who are willing to see reason!" Everything was going black as he dragged me from the room and down the hallway. He tossed me to the floor in another room and slammed the door shut. "If you refuse to love me, to love Julie, to become a happy family, this is what awaits you." And he walked away, leaving me in total darkness. It took several minutes of gasping for air before I could think to figure out where I was. When I started to really think clearly, the musty smell of the room was the first thing that hit me. I blindly felt around the pitch-black room to try and get an idea of what was around me. The room was much smaller than my previous holding, and it wasn't long before my hands felt something cold and soft. I jumped back, pressed myself hard enough against the wall. My eyes slowly adjusted to the darkness until I could just barely make out my surroundings. I shared my room with a corpse. A young woman. She wore a frilly pastel dress and white makeup had been caked all over her skin. She looked like a life-size porcelain doll. I don't know how long I spent in that room, cowered in a corner, trying my best to keep my distance from the body. Eventually my captor returned and took my hand as he led me from the room. He took me back to my original cell and we sat on the floor together, my head never rising to look at him, as he explained how things were going to be from now on, how we were going to be a happy, loving family. Or I'd be joining his ex in the closet. He left me alone for the night to think things over. I spent the whole night crying as I realized that I had no choice. I was weak from exhaustion and wouldn't have been able to overpower this man at my peak physical fitness. I knew that my only chance of survival was to give in, to be the mother he wanted me to be and become hyper-vigilant. I would always be looking for that one opportunity I needed to escape. The next day, he asked if I was ready to meet Julie. I nodded my head and he smiled while offering me his hand. He led me down the dark hallway, making sure to slow down as we passed the room that held his prior captive. He returned back and grinned at me. "I'm so glad you decided to come around. We're going to be so happy." He led me to the room, which would be my own for the rest of my captivity. It was larger than either of the previous rooms, but not by much. The only piece of furniture was a hard-molded plastic bed. Fluorescent lights shone down from the ceiling, safely guarded by a metal cage. On the bed was my very own frilly dress. He left me alone as I changed and then returned to give me my full instructions. From now on, we would refer to each other as Mom and Dad. I would watch over Julie during the day while he was at work, and then we would spend the evening together as a family. He didn't mention what would happen at night, but I feared for the worst. He then left and came back with a cart carrying makeup supplies. He tied my hands behind my back and applied the heavy white makeup. He gave me long fake eyelashes and rosy cheeks, his own personal living doll. And then he announced that it was time to meet Julie. My hands were untied and I was led through the labyrinth of his basement to yet another room. He opened the door and ushered me inside. I found myself in a pristine bedroom designed for a little girl, like something out of a Sears catalog. In the center of the room, seated in a large chair in front of a tea set, I saw Julie. She was a fucking doll. A 12-inch hard plastic doll. I turned to look back at my captor and he was all smiles. He motioned me towards the room and whispered for me to go in and introduce myself. Not seeing any other choice, I did exactly this. I sat down in front of Julie and introduced myself in my best sing-song voice. I told her how I was going to be her new mommy and we were going to have so much fun together. I could practically feel the glee radiating from my captor. He shut the door and left us alone. I looked around the room and didn't see any cameras. There was no windows on the door either. So I kept up talking to Julie just in case he was listening, and set about searching every square inch of the room for anything I could use as a weapon, but there was nothing. Just cheap plastic, no glass, no ceramic, nothing with any weight behind it. Even Julie only weighed a single pound. I thought about trying to steal one of the little plastic spoons and working into a shiv, but when I applied any pressure, it just bent. It wouldn't break, and I couldn't see to shave a point into it. There was not enough strength in anything here to be effectively wielded against a much larger foe. I felt completely defeated. After that, we fell into a routine just like he'd described. During the day, I was locked in Julie's room. I usually used this time to catch up on sleep. The carpeted room was much more comfortable than the hard plastic bed in my own room. When my captor returned home, we would have dinner. He cooked everything and then brought it to me on a paper plate to feed to Julie as he talked about his day. I was never given a plate for myself, and I quickly learned that Julie's food was actually for me. I would mime feeding it to her, and then he would turn his head so I could put the food into my own mouth. It was never much. Enough food to sustain a doll, maybe, but not a grown woman. I was being kept weak. In the evenings or during weekends when he was home all day long, we would play board games or charades. I'm not sure how I managed to keep my sanity when it was Julie's turn to act out a clue. Thankfully, my worst fear never came to fruition. At the end of the night, I was never asked to come back to his bed. He showed me to my room and locked the door, and I would wait until the next day for it to all begin again. Things carried on like this for 2 weeks before there was any change in our routine. One morning, in addition to my change of dress for the day, my captor also left me a menstrual cup. I was honestly surprised that he would even think of this need, but as time went on, I noticed he was somewhat obsessed by it. After I changed into my dress each day and he returned to take me to Julie, he would look around the room until he found the cup, and then he would frown in disappointment. I really wish I had never found out why. He seemed distant one night and barely said a word through dinner. When he walked me back to my room at the end of the night, he didn't say goodnight and leave, but instead lingered in the doorway before coming into the room and taking a seat on my bed. He patted the spot next to him and waited until I took a seat. "Mother," he said, I can't help but notice that you haven't had any visitors." He had heavily emphasized the last word. Heavily. It took me a moment to realize what he was talking about. It was true that I hadn't had my period during the whole time I was here. It had been at least 6 weeks by my count. While this may not have been entirely accurate, it was obvious that I was late. Under the circumstances, I wasn't really all that surprised. The stress of being held captive and malnourished had thrown my body off, but I didn't know how to explain this to my captor. There was no telling whether or not something would set him off into a blind rage again, so I kept silent. "I know Julie isn't real." This caught me completely off guard. My captor sounded so distant and sad as he continued, "But she's so important to me. You have become so important to me, to us, to our family. I know you feel it. You aren't like the last one. Julie and I need you as much as you need us." He then turned to me and kissed me on the forehead before walking out of the room. "I know we're close. You can feel the love in this household as much as I can. When you are visited, let me know right away. We'll finally be able to bring Julie the love she needs." And then he locked me in for another sleepless night. After another week went by and my period still had not come, I could see the panic start to set into my captor's face. To make matters worse, the smell seeping out of the room with the corpse grew stronger and stronger. My captor tried to counteract this with air fresheners, but it was clear that everything was becoming too much for him. He started to make a habit of talking to me before bed. He was worried that Julie didn't have much more time. He was prepared to take drastic measures to give Julie the life she deserved. I could tell that he was starting to crack as his incoherent plans failed to work. I began to worry that I would end up in the closet room with the other woman whether or not I continued to play house with him. So I took his face into my hands and turned him to me. His watery eyes locked onto mine, and I could see the desperation in them. "What can I do to help, Dad?" I asked him. And that's when he shared his grand plan with me. He wanted to make Julie into a real girl, a living, breathing human daughter. He knew the only way to do this was to give her 2 loving parents. That's what was required to create a child. He then grabbed me by the hand and dragged me to another room in the basement I had never been allowed to enter. This was clearly somewhere I was not ever supposed to step foot in. It was not kidnap victim proof. There was a large wooden desk in the center, heavy books lined the shelves on the walls, and it was well lit with lamps. I looked around me and saw potential weapons for the first time since I woke up in the basement. He picked up a book and started reading to me, but I barely paid any attention. He spoke of occult nonsense and magical rituals that could be used to create life. My eyes were glued to the ballpoint pen on his desk. I watched him closely, my eyes darting back to the pen as he droned on. I knew this was it. My moment had finally come, but I couldn't waste it by being impatient. So I inched closer to the desk, making sure to smile and nod to his speech. When he finally turned his back to me to find another book, I darted for the desk and grabbed the pen. His eyes went wide and he turned around and saw me holding the pen like a dagger. I stabbed wildly and could actually feel it sink down into his flesh more than once. He tried to get a hold of the pen, but each strike caused him to recoil in pain. I could feel his blood soaking into my dress as he continued to cry and beg me to stop. I stabbed him 3 more times before my blood-soaked hands lost grip to the pen. I pushed his heavy body off of me and ran out of the room as he continued to whimper. The hallways seemed like an endless maze, but eventually I found the stairs, which would take me to the ground floor. The door at the top of the stairs had an electronic keypad. I was still trapped. By this time, my captor was at the bottom of the staircase, holding one hand to the many wounds on his body. He was crying and covered in blood. It was a beautiful sight, only ruined when he raised the revolver in his other hand. "Why?" he asked me in a pained whisper. He was clearly more hurt by this imagined betrayal than the actual damage I'd inflicted with the pen. "How could you do this to me, Mom? Julie means so much to you." I didn't know what to do. Continuing to fight meant getting shot, but giving up, after all that I had done, there was no going back. I rushed down the stairs and leapt onto him. I beat his face with every ounce of strength my malnourished body could muster. For all my effort, it was met with pistol to the nose, and the world quickly went black. The stench of death welcomed me when I woke up back in the small room which held Julie's previous mother. That was it. My final resting place. I knew I would never leave this dark room alive. In an ironic twist, I finally got my period that night. My captor had waited so long for this, and now it didn't matter. Or did it? A plan started to develop, and I found a new sense of hope. I crawled my way to the door and leaned my tired and beaten body against it. Through my blood-filled mouth, I did my best to put on an innocent voice. "I know you're still out there. Please forgive me, Daddy. I didn't mean it. You know how women get this time of the month." At this, I could hear movement in the hallway and I couldn't help but smile. This man was just as dumb as I thought. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I just couldn't control myself. Please help me, I need you. And Julie needs me. She's gonna be through this same thing soon, Dad. If I'm not there to help explain it, she might go crazy and hurt you too. Please, let's talk about this." The door slowly opened. My captor stood there covered in bandages but still holding the gun. I smiled and spread my arms wide for a hug. "I didn't mean to hurt you, please forgive me." And he hugged me. We stood over the dead body of his previous victim and proclaimed our love for each other. I promised him that we would be together forever and Julie would finally have the loving family she deserved. He led me back to my room and had me strip off my blood-soaked dress. This was the first time he had ever made me change with him in the room. I was terrified that he was testing my loyalty after what had happened. He used the dress to wipe the blood from my face, and then he brought a small jar out of his pocket. I had to bite my lip as he collected the blood from me that he had waited so long for. I had to fight every urge to scream as he left the room but stayed at the doorway. He forced me to watch as he added his own fluid to the jar. He stared at me the whole time, crying and professing his love. Then he finally left and locked the door. I was completely broke down. He didn't return for a long time after that. I began to fear that he didn't need me anymore, that what I had just endured had only brought me a larger room to die in. And that's when he returned with a brand new corpse. I couldn't hide the fear on my face when he showed me the freshly dead body of a small girl. He explained how this was the final step. He had retrieved the body from a grave last night, and now our love would be able to transfer Julie's spirit into the dead body. She would finally be a real girl. Tears in his eyes the whole time he explained this to me. I had never seen him so happy. He cradled Julie in his arms and kissed her head. "It won't be long now, my love." And then he turned and gave Julie to me while he prepared for the ritual. "We did it, Mommy. Our family is finally going to be whole." He bent over the corpse, drawing on the floor with our combined fluids. I saw the gun was tucked in his waistband. Fuck patience. This time I just dove for it. He was so happy and distracted, I was able to snag it with ease. When he turned around at the state of panic, I already had the gun against Julie's head. "The code," I said coldly. "Well, what? No, what are you doing?" "Give me the fucking code or this ritual is ending right fucking now." He spit out the numbers as quickly as he could and pressed his hands together, begging me to not hurt Julie. I pulled the trigger and the doll exploded. I'm not ashamed to admit that I laughed as I watched this man claw the pieces of his doll close to his heart. He blubbered and screamed in anguish as I casually walked up the stairs and punched in the code. I heard the lock click and pushed the door open before returning down to the stairs to unload every last bullet into that son of a bitch.